All righty. Good evening. It's April 29th, and I'm Caroline Crawford, welcoming you to Pequot Library. We have an amazing program tonight with author, educator, filmmaker, and the most important thing, he's a great friend of Pequot Library and a great friend of mine. We have Webb. We are in for such a treat. We appreciate you, being here. Deej will be speaking on Of Human Bondage, a history of slavery in Connecticut. This is going to be amazing. Deej will talk for 40-ish minutes, 45 minutes.
Let's see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. We'll play it by ear. It's going to be amazing. If you guys have any questions, you can throw them in the Q&A and hopefully Deej will get to them. If not, you can email us tomorrow and I can put you in touch. But we are thrilled to have you, Deej. This is so great. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the Pequot Library. And I say this every time I go to the Pequot Library. It's my favorite place to volunteer. It's my favorite place to hang out. And as I always joke, but it's true, in order to get hired at the Pequot Library, you've got to take a nice test. If you don't pass, this isn't the place for you. So I've never, ever, ever worked with such a uniformly nice staff. So I wanted to thank the library in general. I wanted to thank Caroline, who is a very best friend, Stephanie, Jen, Christine, and Grace. Miss you guys. And just as a little background before we start, and I'm going to move with all deliberate speed, and you're not going to see me until the end. We'll go with the flow. I've got a lot of information, a lot of primary sources, stuff you've never seen before about some surprises you're going to learn about Connecticut, as I did. I've got a background as an educator. I taught for 24 years history at New Canaan High School, and I taught at Sacred Heart University, including U.S. history that entire time. So I like to think I've got a pretty good background on slavery, but boy, have I learned a lot in just the past year or so. So I'm going to keep you for an hour. I'm sure some of you are getting zoomed out, but that's another story. And I'll pop in at the end. So an hour. If it takes me an hour, again, we'll skip the chats and questions. If it doesn't, I'll take some questions. So I'm going to make two transitions from myself to the images you're going to see. And then at the end of all the images, I'll pop on at the end. So let's get started. All right, and thanks for joining us. I hope everybody is healthy and happy. What's interesting is exactly a century ago, we were dealing as a country with two identical challenges that we do today. One was a pandemic, and not to make light of COVID, I don't have to tell you, but the only protection was masks, and that killed 50 million people. So that was the influenza pandemic of 1919, 1920, and it went on and on and on. And also the worst race riots since the Civil War and Reconstruction, 32 cities with mass lynchings and burnings. It was also the height of the white power nationalist movement, of course, exemplified by the KKK, that had its highest membership of all time. We think of it as, being the Civil War, but it actually had its highest membership in the 1920s. And of course, we're seeing the rise of white nationalism again today. Okay, let me set the stage just a bit historically about slavery. It's not understood, and everybody with our modern mindset can't really grasp it and thinks it's horrifying. But watch, if you were to take human history, and let's imagine it's a football field, and you're at one end of the field on the goal line, and you're marching forward, right? Take that entire field, and until you get to the 1-inch line, slavery existed. It's the economic engine of human history. And it's only recently, and by the way, it still exists in parts of the world, it's only recently that we've had the luxury not to have slavery. I always told my students, why memorize dates? They're kind of irrelevant, but no, they have meaning. The Civil War happened, among other things, but it really happened because by the mid-1860s, we had the technology not to have to rely on it anymore. It goes back to the Sumerians 9,000 years ago, went into Greece, other parts of the Middle East, ancient East, and then China and India. So it is the world's second oldest profession. And it, in terms of human history, it ended about a minute ago, okay? All right, I want to thank all the following organizations for allowing me to do research. What I'll be doing is using, when possible, primary sources, and again, ones that I think you've never seen before. I'm pretty sure with some of them. So I want to thank all these places that were kind enough to help me and allow me to do research. I just had a very, very interesting time 2 years ago in South Carolina, which we're going to talk about in depth as we go forward. I also want to give a heavy gratitude to the Westport Museum that did Remembered, an absolutely groundbreaking exhibit chaired by a wonderful historian, Ramin Ganeshram. It won absolutely multiple deserving awards, and I was blown away by what I saw in the exhibit, and I'll be sharing some of it. And at the end, what I'm going to try to have you encouraged to do is go online and see this exhibit. It's second to none. I think it's the best work that the Westport Historical Society has ever done. Okay, in America, before African Americans, Indians were enslaved. As a matter of fact, between 2 and 4 million Indians in the Americas were enslaved before the year 1700. And where that begins is, beside the Spanish holdings, is in Old Saybrook, and it is in Fairfield. So you probably know about the Swamp War. By the way, it happened all around the Pequot Library. And if you're interested, we lead tours of historic Southport, and the Pequot War is part of the history. This is the first shot of what will be 2 centuries of combating the Indians and essentially committing genocide. If you thought you got land in Fairfield, if you thought you got Pequot slaves. So they were taken by some of the soldiers, some of them because there was a dearth of domestic help, were taken in and helped the women in Fairfield in their homesteads. And the rest were sold into the most brutal, murderous slavery in places like Nicaragua and the West Indies. This is the famous Journals of John Winthrop, who was the head of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this is the source if you want to study the early English point of view of Massachusetts Bay, the first colonists. He's the major governor. And what's interesting is he writes about this time period where they defeat the Indians and they begin to practice slavery. And I'm just going to let you read this. This is from one of the soldiers reporting to John Winthrop what he did and what they did with the Native Americans they captured in Fairfield and also Old Saybrook. Now, this led to sexual exploitation. This led to children being separated from families. It's barbaric, it's murderous. And of course, this is the template that African-American slavery is going to follow. Well, the role of tobacco. For many of you from your US history days, you'll learn that tobacco in 1607 was something that began slavery in earnest in Virginia. What's interesting is there's genetic determinism here. One of the reasons that African Americans were used in labor in the South was that by and large, they were immune to malaria, okay, and the whites weren't. So what happened was they imported a workforce that was genetically superior to the Europeans, and could actually survive. Of course, they didn't survive because of maltreatment in many cases, and maybe most cases. By the way, what Caucasians won't really get is sickle cell anemia. That's what African Americans suffer from. But this is the single most important crop in American history. So let's forget smoking cigarettes and how bad it is. Let's celebrate and these are ads for tobacco from Virginia. They're not exactly politically correct, but it made fortunes overnight. And it financed and allowed us to win the American Revolution. Okay, now what I'm going to try to do is not read everything that I've posted for you, but little is it known to many people that it was nicknamed the Tobacco War because continental money was worthless. We pulled away from England. And the way without France, there's no America, and without America, there's no France. We're talking about the American Revolution former and World War II latter. So to get the loans from them and the Dutch, and that's the only way we financed the war, was through tobacco. And then after the war, the way we stabilized intense inflation, perhaps the worst in American history, was tobacco. So tobacco is the founding principle in many ways of our entire Republican experience. I mean, look what Washington says there. The next one, and we'll get into this later, was invented. By the way, England was importing by 1700, 20 million pounds of tobacco a year, 20 million pounds. All right, a lot of people don't understand that the cotton gin was invented by somebody from Connecticut, Eli Whitney, in 1794. So right after the American Revolution, a machine is invented that allows slavery to explode. Now, one of the things that you can, kind of think about is, well, how does a machine cause more human labor? One of the stats is that one enslaved person could pick 10 pounds of cotton, get the seeds out of it, 10 pounds a day. The cotton gin, 100 pounds a day. But what happened was, because of this increased processing ability, it created more demand for cotton. And as you see, slavery grew in proportion. And by the way, for the first half of American history, the South is king. And we'll talk about that later. Besides tobacco, cotton comes in and becomes the most single important commodity in American history. That's why it's entwined with the Civil War. Okay, this is the triangular trade. Many of you probably remember this from schools. It's between Africa, Caribbean, and New England. But what's interesting is the role of Connecticut in this has really been never explored. Well, it's been explored, but it hasn't been taught. Because one of these things is that farms in Connecticut sent wood and livestock and food to sugar plantations, all right, in the West Indies. And what we did is that we fed the slaves. So without this food supply, there's no ability for the slaves to survive in the West Indies. And keep in mind that 80% of African slaves went to the West Indies, not America. Only 20% of African slaves went to North America. And we fought a civil war over that. So you got to imagine the other 80% are in the West Indies doing backbreaking, dangerous, murderous work. And we also sold sugar, rum, and molasses. And as we'll talk about it, that was critical to the Connecticut economy. As a matter of fact, major fact, the Connecticut in the 18th century became an economic powerhouse because of what we shipped to the West Indies. Some of the first fortunes in Connecticut history are made by all these products from Connecticut farms and light manufacturing that goes down and allows, again, the sugar trade to occur. It was a horror show. Sugar was from the New World. And I always used to talk to students and I said, imagine not living with tobacco, and then it's invented. What a great drug, which is what it is. Imagine not having sugar as we know it, and it arrives at basically the same time. And then the most comfortable fabric in the history of the world. We're not talking wool here, we're talking cotton. What was the old ad campaign, Fruit of the Loom, the fabric that we all wear? You know, I'm screwing it up. But again, slavery explodes to do this because, again, genetically, the African Americans can survive better than the whites in these terrible, terrible climates. Here's a sugar processing factory. This was the height of technology in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yep. Now, the cotton gin comes along, but that and the way to process sugar were the best machines and the first machines that humanity saw in the New World. So this is the Industrial Revolution begins here, really. All right, 6 of the first 7 American presidents were slave owners. And, you know, it's around this time that we begin massive trade with England, which ties us to the British economy. Not only that, the first 6 or 7 are slave owners, but all of these were slave owners too. Critical, just to point out, Grant owned slaves, but for a very brief period of time, and he released them. So he's on the list, but really, he was very good about it in the end. Andrew Johnson is after Lincoln's assassinated. So the North wins the Civil War. And what does Johnson do right after the war? He basically turns back a lot of the gains that African Americans had made as a result of the American Civil War. This, might remember it from your US history, AP US history, is the darkest single political act in American history. Considered obscure by many people who study history lightly, but here was the critical thing. The North was more populous, and the South, at the Constitutional Convention, demanded that they increase their representation in the House and Senate by having slaves count as 3/5 of a person. So what this does is, again, it gives the South the power, and the South controls the United States until the Civil War. Cotton is king, and again, the first half of American history is completely dominated by the South. Just want to show you this chart from the National Archives. Take a look at South Carolina. So don't worry about it. These are the southern states, the amount of slaves that they have, and the percentage of slaves. And you can see that South Carolina is off the charts. In 1828, the income from the United States came from the tariff, taxation of imported goods and some exported goods. Before the Civil War, based upon slavery and its production of cotton and tobacco, 4/5, 80% of the income of the United States government came from a single state, South Carolina. Incredible. By the way, South Carolina is where more history has happened. 200 battles alone in the American Revolution. No other place saw more warfare. And again, when you've got 57% of the slaves, and you've got the North saying, okay, we're going to ban slavery, all their investments are going to go up. And of course, since they had the most, they're the first to secede. It's a plain and simple economic argument. And in 1860, when the Civil War begins, if the Confederacy had been a separate nation, it would have ranked 4th richest in the world as a country, 4th richest. So there's a reason they thought they could win the Civil War. And 75% of the world's cotton came from the United States. And what happened was this became the backbone for the textile industry in England, which was going through an explosion of the Industrial Revolution, the biggest exporter of the Industrial Revolution. And so the English economy becomes very tied to the Southern economy. And basically, for most of the war, England wants and supports the South to win. Okay, here's the Connecticut Constitution of 1818. It's a beautiful, beautiful document. What happened was at the Constitutional Convention, so we're talking about 1783, Connecticut agreed to a fatal agreement with the South, where Connecticut voted to extend slavery by 20 years. All right, so it made an unholy alliance with the South. So on a macro national level, Connecticut is complicit with slavery. At the height of slavery in Connecticut, half of all ministers, lawyers, and public officials owned slaves. So the ruling professional class plus the professional middle class owned half the slaves. All right. And by the way, in Connecticut, guess where slavery flourished the most? Fairfield County. And we'll get to that story. I don't mean to laugh, but I know that that's probably pretty shocking. When Connecticut came up with a revised constitution in 1818, it had already passed in 1784 an act of gradual abolition. And what it said was that children born into slavery after March 1784 would be freed by the time they turned 25. That sounds great, sounds wonderful, yay for Connecticut. Problem was, this extended slavery in Connecticut till 1848. So we're practicing slavery almost as long as the South does. All right, here's a beautiful map of Connecticut. Absolutely fantastic to see this in person. And by the American Revolution, roughly about 6,500 enslaved people live in Connecticut. By the way, the most of any state in New England. Now, one reason I predicate is that we were the southernmost northern state. So we probably had, even though it's terrible to grow things around here, we probably had the warmest climate, if you can believe that, but compare it to Maine, right? Or even Massachusetts. So Connecticut had the most amount of slaves in the Northern Union, all the way up to the Civil War. It was the last to free its slaves. And when they did the gradual emancipation, it was largely ignored. And so when we are in school and we learn about Connecticut, we learn that we are the good guys. And look, we are in so many ways. I'm not here bashing Connecticut, but I want to put it in its historical context. When Harriet Beecher Stowe of Connecticut, and she writes the seminal book in Hartford, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and when Lincoln meets her at the White House, it might be, they think it's a true story, but we're not sure. He shakes her hand and says, "So you are the woman, the little woman who started this great big war." But so this creates this sort of persistent fantasy that we were a leader in abolitionism. And in ways, as we'll learn today, we were. But when you're the most reluctant state to abolish slavery, that's nothing to boast of. If you look to New London County to the east of this map, there was a plantation, a multi-thousand acre plantation in New London that rivaled the biggest plantations in the South. So let that sink in. And Middletown and New London were some of the biggest areas of slave activity, New London being the biggest exporter of slaves from Connecticut. So, there was a whole line of people making a fortune in the maritime trade with slavery. And by the way, those slaves are going down south. They're producing cotton, which comes up to the textile mills of Connecticut. The bankers who are financing the indebted planters, many of them are from Connecticut. So the North was completely complicit in the slave trade because that's where the money was. Okay. until the machines were invented, it was a great investment. There were black sailors. African Americans did a bunch of different things. And up to the 20th century, now you might see on like Discovery Channel, you know, the killing of elephants, this terrible murder that goes on in Africa for their ivory tusks. Well, what was interesting was that towns on the Connecticut River were the national center for ivory production, milling hundreds of thousands of tons of elephant tusks through the enslavement and death of more than 1 million people in Africa. So when you see what's happening there with the murder of those elephants for the ivory, keep in mind America's #1 role with that, Connecticut's #1 role with that. So going to some wonderful primary documents here. There was a series of laws, 1793 and 1850, Fugitive Slave Acts, and that mandated at the federal level that enslaved people, if they were captured, including in the North, had to be returned to their masters. And those that aided and abetted them, of course, on the Underground Railroad, as you can imagine, were up to stiff penalties and even imprisonment. So Connecticut was implicit with that when these slave traders come up. And by the way, if you have not seen 12 Years a Slave, treat yourself. Absolutely extraordinary. They had to be forcibly returned. And you can see the ads here that are trying to warn African Americans against these slave catchers. And again, what's interesting is to see these descriptions on the left. Talking about a 22-year-old, 5, 6, or 8 inches high, rather chunky built, bushy head, divided on one side, keeps it nicely combed. So they did as much as they could. And then there's the girl on the right, low, soft manner of speech, and she's 24 years old. So these were frequent advertisings in the North, including Connecticut papers. All right, we're going to get a little bit more specific towards home. This is the Saugatuck River in Westport. And it was a thriving place. By the way, there's a big argument whether or not to dredge it now, but it was much deeper back then. So schooners, like the ones that went into Southport Harbor, because it was relatively shallow, in the 18th and 19th century, this is where white, enslaved, and free Black Westporters worked. And they unloaded products from Boston, New York, Charleston, and shipped them out from the agrarian farms in Connecticut. And once again, where did a lot of this food go? The West Indies, right? The West Indies. So Westport, Fairfield, Southport, complete aiders and abettors of slavery. It took a village to practice slavery, if you want to look at that. And here's the ship's log. Don't worry, I'll focus in on this, but these are ship's logs that arrive in Westport, full of Negro names. All right, now, if really quickly, you take a look to the left side of the chart, go over 3, those are Negro names, and look at the list. And this is from 2 ships, okay? This is 2 ships. Fairfield, by that time it was Westport. And this is the log of the human cargo that was imported into Connecticut. And just, I wanted to focus on this. On the left are the vessels, the Lady Adventure and the Grand Duchess of Russia. But you see right there the descriptions and the names. Mr. Dyer, stout mulatto, of 25. By the way, Americans at that time classified African Americans 4 ways. 1, mulatto, half white, half black. Quadroon, you had a grandparent that was black. Octoroon, you had a great-grandparent that was black. And high yellow, which means you could pass for white. And Sally Hemings was a great example of this with Jefferson. This is that much of a race-conscious society that they break up African Americans into 4 distinct categories. And people were deadly serious about this because the worst thing was a Black person. The next worst, a little bit more, acceptable, was a mulatto, half white, half Black. Then, well, there's a grandparent, so they're even better. Then a great grandparent, well, that's even better. And then high yellow, they, look. At the bottom, you see Dinah being described as a low wench at age 20. Well, terrible, terrible, not a great phrase. This is the wall of names that's at the Westport Historical Society, and they are representative of the Greens Farms Church record book. All right, now at that time, there were Westporters that attended it and more Fairfielders. And they listed baptism, marriage, and deaths of just here 241 enslaved people and 19 free people of color from 1742 to 1822. So in an 80-year period, and this is before, during, and after the American Revolution, you have 241 enslaved people here. And what was done was, you'll notice that some of the names were based upon Roman figures, Tiberius, Caesar. This was kind of a cruel way of showing that these people with no power had names of very powerful people. And so that was just absolutely terrible. And some were biblical names. The reason they were biblical was that people at the time defended slavery because it's in the Bible. And by the way, if you look at the Bible, it's true, it's mentioned. So you can look at the Bible and say slavery is okay, and you can look at the Bible and say it's not. All right, I'll steer you through this, and then I'm going to focus on some things, so I'll zoom in. But really, the main founding families, almost all of them, the Coleys, the Nashes, the Jessops, the Hydes, the Banks, were wealthy slave owners. That's the reason that they become so powerful, among other things. But again, more slaves, you buy more land, you become a bigger farmer. And so we see here, what they did was slaves were provided for in wills, and they were posted as bond in legal proceedings, and mortgages to secure collateral to secure mortgages. So a vibrant and powerful economic tool for people in the area. So this is the list of an estate from a deceased person. You have things like sheets, blankets, wool, candles, alcohol, silver, but you also have slaves. So I'm going to focus in on one, and there is the Negro wench called Bet or Let, I guess it's probably Bet, and her child. And again, a piece of property. Remember, in 1857, with the Dred Scott case, officially, it was ruled that African Americans were not people, that they were property, pieces of furniture. The U.S. government had that on the books in 1857, officially declared that African Americans were essentially non-human, inanimate pieces of property. Another one, don't worry, I'll focus in on this. This is, again, a legal document. And it says that the Hydes of Fairfield, because remember, Westport was not Westport till the 1830s. And what they're doing is to mention a Negro, as you see on the right, and again, as a piece of property. Okay, and these were signed, countersigned, and these are very powerful people that were engaged in this sort of trade. Wonderful exhibit at the Westport Museum. African American slaves in the North lived a very different existence. They were slaves, so don't forget that. But instead of living in slave huts, like they did in the South for the most part, They lived in eaves of houses up at the attic. Now, keep in mind, that sounds, well, that's better than a hut, right? But have you ever been in an uninsulated attic in the winter, or I would argue even worse, the heat of summer? And what you see to the left is a chimney. And so you say, gee, that provided warmth, and it did. But remember, you had a fire going all day long. It's the first thing you tended before you went to bed. You made sure it was going to go all night. So the heat. They slept at the foot of people's beds. They slept in the hallways. And this is Stratford, by the way, was the biggest slave market in Connecticut. And here you have a sale of flora. And what they've done is that they've done a silhouette. Obviously, there's no photography at that time, and it's attached to her sale. And again, I was pretty stunned to learn that Stratford was the center of the slave trade, the slave markets. Often the slaves are stripped nude and they're bid on by white people. So interesting. But I find this an interesting thing because you do get a sense of what flora look like. All right, this is the New Haven Gazette of 1787. And here you see somebody from Green's Farms wanting to get Amos, his slave, back, describing his hair as low on his forehead, and a cut on his elbow, under jacket, trousers. So this is Green's Farms. This is after 4 years after the American Revolution has been successfully concluded. And here's an ad in the New Haven Gazette for an escaped slave from Green's Farms. This is always an amazing place. This is the lower burial ground of Green's Farms Church. It's right by the exit 18 connector. And this is at the corner of Green's Farms, which was a major thoroughfare at the time. And again, the Sherwood Island connector. And by the way, in that back area, so take a look at that right photo in that back area. Those are graves of African Americans that are unmarked. So it's really interesting to go. And by the way, when you go in the cemetery, just through the main gate, just go all the way to the back right, where you can essentially see Nyala Farms. Those are the cars parked for the hedge fund there. And that area is where the Westport Historical Society has surmised are bodies of unmarked slaves. Americans, I'll stand by that. There are two notable ones that are there because these were stoned graves. One of them's fallen down, but one of them is for Dorcas Hyde, and it was enslaved by John Hyde, who was the church deacon. All right, who was the church deacon? And so, everybody was implicit of it. And the other one is Lizette Monroe, wife of Henry Monroe, the first Black landowner in Westport. And I'll show you that in just a minute. This was the single most dramatic item that I saw at the exhibit. And I don't know if you can read it, but I think you can. It's Bob, and he's described as an N-word. And just seeing this, you know how it is when you just see something that brings it all home to you? This is the saddest and pretty much the most dramatic thing that I saw. And this is by Stonewall in Newtown. So even in death, African Americans were not treated with much dignity at all. And this is the Henry Monroe House. It's still there on Cross Highway, built by the first African American landowner. He bought it from John Burr. So you're learning all these names, hearing all these names of the founding fathers, right? Burr, Sherwood, Coley, right? And His farm appears on the tax rolls of 1805, but this is really interesting. So this house almost got torn down. Now, and is always threatened by being torn down, depending on who buys it. But most colonial houses were built on the English style, which is measurements of 16.5 feet. And so that was called a rod. But this one's built on a 12-foot measurement convention, which is African. Isn't that amazing? So really, the way the measurements of this house are used using African measurements and not European colonial ones. You can see it today. All right. If you have not heard this man's name, you should read this man's book, because this is one of the nation's first slave narratives in 1798, and scholars consider it the most important of such works. It's an autobiography, obviously the narrative of him, and he was a slave in New London, and it is absolutely gripping reading. He was owned by 3 masters, 2 of which were terrible and beat him, separated him from his family. You know, I showed you a picture engraving before of a master separating a child from the parents. And again, just that single act, that single vignette. Imagine seeing your child ripped out of your arms. And they did it at all ages. They did it to infants. They did it to little kids, and on up. And that was it. And many of these were shipped, and intentionally so far away, so that they wouldn't be encouraged to escape. You know, they go into South Carolina, and they were marooned and doomed. But by the way, the term maroon comes from Black slaves that escaped, bonded with Native Americans, lived in the deep swamps and forests, and they were called maroons. You know, I think that's really kind of interesting. So here are the descriptions of him. He was said to carry a 9-pound axe, split 7 cords of wood each day. I don't know if you've ever done that for fun at your house, but you've never done that for fun at your house. You've probably never done that ever. And if you did, you'd never do it again. And he was also described as carrying a barrel of molasses on his shoulders for 2 miles and hauling hundreds of pounds of salt. He was a sailor. He fished on Long Island Sound, and he became a small-scale trader. But he also invested in land. So this is extremely rare also for someone who became a free man. In 1770, on the right, there's the deed to a 26-parcel estate that bordered his former master, who was very sympathetic to him, and not Thomas Stanton. But by the way, this is now, and you can visit it, this is the Barn Island Wildlife Preserve there. So an incredibly important document. It's an African-American owning slaves. Well, he was a very, very, very good investor. And what he did was he began to purchase land in small pieces. He cut lumber. It grew over to 100 acres. And here is his large complex. And this is where he reunites his family. So you can imagine what that must have been, the dramatic scene. Of course, because he's so important, he came to the interests of archaeologists. And there is his gravestone. You can still visit it to this day in East Haddam. And at the bottom is the partial description of him that's on that headstone that you can take a second to read, and I'll stop for a second. To go from nothing, I mean, this is an American success story. I'll argue it's pretty much the American success story, starting from a slave and nothing to owning this much land and a vibrant working complex with blacksmith shops and docks and everything like that. So one of the things you can see is his excavated grave there. And what archaeologists have commented that this grave, which he was put in, it is the most remarkable opportunity to get a complete reconstruction of American slave riders, including this fact, of all the early Black riders, his is the only grave that we can identify. So look at that. Okay, again, going back to that. So they were interested to see if it held genetic information, so his descendants, which exist to this day, can figure out their ancestral ties to Africa. Thing was that Bencher Smith had long turned to dust. They couldn't get anything, but what they did was they began to work on his wife, Meg, and what they discovered was on one matrilineal slide, their heritage went back 80,000 years. That was one maternal side, 80,000 years. Now, in a country that families claim they've got a long history by saying they were one of the 8 billion people who claimed to be descended from the Mayflower. By the way, for all the Americans that claim that their heritage came from the Mayflower, it is mathematically, categorically impossible. It was a handful of people, right? You know, so, and Americans are proud of that, and rightfully so. But you know, we're talking 400 years there. With this family, we're talking 80,000 years. And so this makes them some of the oldest people in the world. And another maternal line they found went back 59,000 to 79,000. They're from Western and West Central Africa. And as you know, humanity begins in Eastern Africa. They begin to spread out and spread humanity. So mankind originates in Africa. So these were the ones who went out and populated the rest of the world. And we have a remnant of it in East Haven, Connecticut. Okay, the American Revolution, African Americans served with distinction, even though they were not free. At first, they were barred from enlistment in the Continental Army. The British admitted them and gave them freedom. So, you know, the bad redcoats, they're not bad in this topic, okay? And what they did was they relocated. They knew they had to get them out of the country because after the war, the British knew what would happen to them. And so they went to Nova Scotia. So if you're ever in Nova Scotia, that is the seat of where loyalist African Americans were placed. So there's a very vibrant ancestry there of African Americans. And some in the Continental Army were freed. What they did was that they would fight instead of their master. Okay, so let me just explain what you see on the left. It's an African American in a Rhode Island regiment. What you see on the right is a very famous painting with really almost the centerpiece of this. So it's really interesting to see this from a European perspective, where this African American is fighting, and he's magnificently portrayed. And so Nero Hawley, and there's his grave, it's in Trumbull. He was from North Stratford, and what he did was, his name was Hawley because they took their master's last names. He enlists in place of his owner, and he begins to fight in some of the most major battles from 1777 on. I mean, this guy is everywhere. Battle of Monmouth, which was massively important in the history of the American Revolution. And indeed, guess what? He goes and suffers at Valley Forge as well. Not only that, but he was at one point in Ridgefield. And as you know, there was an engagement there. And of Washington's army at Valley Forge, of the 15 slaves that were from North Stratford, 3 of them were Hawleys. So it was a patriotic bunch of young men. By the way, what are their names? Abraham, Nathan, Nero. So we go back to that biblical or Roman sort of connotation. Nero marries the slave servant of a pastor in 1761. So, you probably would surmise that men of God would be against slavery, but that was far from the case. It became, with the abolitionist movement, it became really a centerpiece of religious personages. But at this time, it was very common to do that. And what's interesting is they have records of him receiving a pension from the US government. He got $3.33 in 1808, and he was, they raised it to 40 by 1813. So they were pretty good about recompensing him. Died at 75, and you can go visit him at the Riverside Cemetery in Trumbull to this day. And there it is. Okay. This is a military payment voucher for Cuff Liberty of Fairfield, which is now Westport. Okay. And I'll give you a second to read this, because these, to have these primary documents and see them and handle them is just history coming alive. So it's 1781. And he's being paid, and he signs his name. So, recognized by the US government, and he can write. So, again, African Americans in the American Revolution. And now, and it was even before the interest in this renewed interest in African American history, the Black Lives movement being part of that. Even before then, they are discovering more and more the role of African Americans in the American Revolution. Much more and more and more. By the way, and this is fair to say, the upper class whites, so we'll talk about Fairfield County because that's where we live, were not represented in the colonial army. This was the lower orders. These were ex-slaves. These were slaves who had nowhere else to turn. But upon them rest the victories of Washington's army. So a lot of the officers obviously were the upper class, but it was much more of a polyglot army than any of the history books previously have really ever discussed. It's been whitewashed, no pun intended, but pun intended. It's been whitewashed. If you go up to Litchfield, and by the way, Cuff Liberty, he named it Liberty because he wanted to obviously accentuate that he was, a free man, and who knows. In 1833, up in Litchfield, Prudence Crandall opened a school for young misses of color in, quote unquote, in Canterbury, Connecticut. Well, this didn't go well. Talk about the ultimate, not in my backyard, talk about the ultimate NIMBY. The neighbors ostracized her, tried to destroy the school, passed laws to shut it down, put her on trial, and put her in jail, and she fled. She fled. So one of the things is when you learn about this in local Connecticut history, you get the sense that the school was there, and it was the first in the country, but the school was there, and it flourished. But it flourished for a while, but then it was forced to close. But one of the reasons was in 1834, Connecticut passed the notorious Black Law, and the Black Law restricted African Americans from coming into the state of Connecticut to get an education. So the state of Connecticut banned any African Americans from coming here for an education, something not to be very proud of. Well, here's the Amistad. Many of you know of this story. It's an absolutely dramatic and extremely important event in American history. And by the way, Amistad, and I was thinking of showing this clip because it shows the horrors of what was called the Middle Passage. Yet it is almost too brutal to watch. There's nudity, there's abuse, but again, that was one of those single moments where I was observing what slavery must have been like, and it's horrifying, horrifying. So watch Amistad, and by the way, there's 6 good books about the whole thing. This was going along the coast of Cuba, and it was going to a port to resell the slaves. And most of the slaves were from Sierra Leone. They'd been kidnapped, illegally sold, and they took over the ship. This was, and again, to see this live and in your hands, this is the way they were transported. Now, you know what I never got? So by the way, look at that. They're in 3 feet, 3 inches high. If you want to, don't try this at home, as they say. And they were packed like that. And they were packed even worse. So this is actually a sanitized version. And the food would be thrown in the hole. I mean, literally, in some cases, just throw it down the hole. Cheap porridge. And what I never really understood was why you would treat your money, your investment so badly. But then I figured it out. There was just so many. 20 million. Okay. Great. From the Connecticut Historical Society. They killed the captain and the cook. 2 other guys escaped. And this is the European version, American version of this event. And I'm going to show you the African American one in just a second. And so they wanted to steer the boat back to Sierra Leone, and they kept the navigators alive. But what the navigators did at night was that they sailed in a different direction, north, in an attempt to get to America at that time. And they were captured by the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service. That's the Coast Guard today. And they were really off the coast of Long Island, but they were brought to Connecticut, where a landmark Supreme Court decision is made. But another reason I wanted to show you this is seeing the Western, quote unquote, view of this event, and then seeing this one. Isn't this just, wow. Talk about an action sequence and the vibrant colors. And an extraordinary painting. This was done in 1938 by a guy named Hale Woodruff, and he was doing murals for a new library at Alabama's Talladega College, and that's one of the first all-black colleges. And this was one of many panels depicting African American history, and here we see it here. So a great compare and contrast of how different peoples see the world. Now, I know that this is difficult to read. I'll explain it, and then I'll focus in. So this is when abolitionists seized the opportunity to really challenge the institution of slavery. It's an incredible turning point, and we should be proud of it. And Samuel Eliot Morison, the great historian, wrote in 1969, it's the most important case concerning slavery until the Dred Scott case of 1857. So on the left is the description, the court description of the Africans, and I'll show you how they were treated, but I'll quote some things. They are severally natives of Africa and born free, still of right ought to be free, not as slaves. And they have suffered great cruelty and oppression, were incited by the love of liberty natural to all men, and wanted to return to their kindred. So that's on the left. On the right, okay, on the right is an extraordinary document by John Adams, all right, written in his own hand. And imagine seeing this, all right, because he defended them. So here we go, and it is a list of the people who were on that ship. There's Cinque, who we'll talk about, but there were very many others: Kimbo, Berna, Kwang, Sessi, Moru. So the abolitionists were sure to humanize these people and get them recognized as such. They also did sketches. Now, this is not all of the Amistad crew of escaped slaves, but it comes out in an 1840 narrative of it, taken by artists at the time. So I really love this. And what's interesting is that Cinque, the leader of the rebellion, is top. He's in the center column, sixth from the right, and you can tell that they, made sure that he was probably, drawn the most elaborately. And this is John Quincy Adams, and this is part of his case. Okay, and Adams does an extraordinary thing. He argues this. Now he's 73 years old. He argues this in Connecticut at the case. 73 years old, second president of the United States. By the way, going back to those 6 out of the first 7 presidents of the United States, he's the only one that was from the North. And he goes here and he argues for 8.5 hours. And it's considered one of the great legal arguments in American history. 8.5 hours, former president of the United States at 73 years old. By the way, he wins. And these people are shipped back, and we'll talk about that in here. This is Foon, and his grave is in Farmington, Connecticut, and you can see it. He drowned, but he's one of the survivors of that mutiny who actually made it, but then he drowned, sadly. And but you can visit. This is one of the great things. You can go and see these markers. Here is Cinque, the great leader of the rebellion, very erudite, gives again a majestic speech on behalf of the freedom of the slaves. There is Kimbo on the right, one of his fellow mutineers. I love this drawing because it's so detailed. It's so detailed. And you really get an essence of the man. And that was rare back then. That was rare, as you can see from the previous one. By the way, in Sierra Leone, he is a national hero, as you can probably imagine. And there you can see him on the 5,000 note of Sierra Leone. So his legacy proudly lives on. All right, I kind of wanted to step back a bit and show you that the racism of the time before the Civil War. Now, this is Harper's Weekly. Keep in mind, Harper's Weekly is the Time, the Life, the Google, the Facebook of its time. It's the single most read and important periodical during, before, and after the Civil War. So if it's on that, you can see that is emblematic of the racist thinking of the time. And so you see a racist character of an African American, and then you see the white, and he's portrayed as a monkey. And what's really interesting in American history, consistently, American artists have portrayed their enemies as monkeys, including, and you can look this up online, it's really interesting to see how we depicted the Japanese in World War II. Same thing, monkeys. So these are the Irish. These are the Irish. And by the way, loathed in Connecticut. As you can see, this is the message. They're equal to black slaves. Here is, I'll show you what this is. This is somebody making a speech. He is intentionally drawn to look like an African American. And this is what he's debating. Okay, now they come to Connecticut in 1848. They instantly become the single bottom of the rung, but above the African Americans. And, they were Catholics, and this was not a Catholic country. This was a WASP, Puritan country. And so there was worries that they would follow the Pope and not listen to the president, and that they carried disease. But the reason they're in Connecticut is for the railroad. But this is another underclass. They're above the African Americans, but their treatment was absolutely horrific. Here is a cartoon from the time period, and I'll give you a second to read it. And there's the terrible word we don't use anymore. But as you can see, it's equating the Irish with African Americans. This is a marriage certificate of this fine couple on the left. His name is Patrick O'Malley. And in the center, under race, he's described as colored. Isn't that interesting? Birthplace, Ireland. Take a look at those. Most people today, if not all people today, would look at that photo and think that they were not colored, but there they are described as colored. So very race-conscious society as we are today. Frederick Douglass, he comes many times. His great series of 4 books about his experience was published in Hartford, and he was treated really, really badly. As a matter of fact, on the way back from Connecticut to England, he was attacked by a group, including a Connecticut Yankee that boasted he had slaves. And he said that one of his worst receptions he ever received was in Hartford, Connecticut. In the American Civil War, and I'm going to move, we are getting towards the end of it, I promise. But Lincoln, after not doing this, it took 2 years and it was a desperate maneuver, allowed blacks into the Union Army. And by the way, Connecticut Democrats argue in the House that these are American Democrats, that it would be absolutely a crime to let these people loose on the helpless South, a quote unquote, a horde of African barbarians, and they predicted black cowardice, disgrace, and ruin. So you can imagine that. Here is the famous 29th. Here they are in Charleston, South Carolina, the seat of the American Civil War from the South, where it all started and where it basically is going to more or less end. Here they are on duty there, and here's just a close-up of them. Extremely proud men, and they are certainly, and the idea that you had a sergeant, another radical idea, and if you really want to get a great sense of African Americans in the Civil War, just check out the classic movie Glory. So absolutely remarkable. And as Douglass gave them a speech in Connecticut, you are the pioneers of the liberty of your race. Not all the powers of darkness can prevent you from being citizens. You are the pioneer. Upon you, the destiny of 4 millions of colored race in the country rests. And here we're seeing, by the way, afterwards, in 1865, Connecticut denied African Americans the right to vote. And if you go to New Haven, you can go, and here is the monument to the 29th Colored Division. This is West Porter Benjamin Tokay. He's on his way to New Orleans on the steamship Planter. There's his account and diary of his trip to New Orleans. Don't worry about reading it because I'm going to give you a shortcut. This is what he, partly of what he writes, and it gives you a good idea of the racial attitudes at that time. And keep in mind, this is a Northern Yankee and from Connecticut. Family, Connecticut, Civil War. And again, the incredible role of African-American women in raising families. Great story. US history textbook used in Connecticut. Now, when is this? How about 1920? Wow. So this is showing the ideal Aryan and the less than ideal moving to the right. So this is what kids in Connecticut were learning from. You might recognize that on the right, the PJ moving sign from 95, and that smokestack there. But this is the first free settled community of African Americans, and it was in 1821. It was nicknamed Ethiop, and it was a village of free blacks and Indians. Had its own school, social organizations, library, and a seaside hotel. It became known as Little Liberia, and quite close-knit community. And the original owners were born free blacks. By the death of one of them, the obituary reads, she had accumulated a considerable property, estimated from, and this is 1883, $30,000 to $50,000. That's really good. She owned several houses. So this really dilapidated house is now on the Connecticut, it's on the National Register for Historic Buildings. And this was, I don't know if they've improved it since. Now, 22.5 Main Street in Westport. In my day, it's still there in a modified form, but that's where Onion Alley was. And this is where 25 African Americans lived in 22 apartments. That's the painting's called the Waffle House, and it's based on the Waffle House that was there. And that is a 1950 cartoon talking about Main Street, because there was continual pressure by Westporters to remove them from town. And then indeed a mysterious fire broke out. It's highly suspect of being arson. And that was the end, really, by and large, of the African-American residency in Westport. And it would take a long time to come back. What was great is this is the path at the Westport Museum of History and Culture with the names of the African slaves and free people. And there, I was amazed, the Westport Museum, Ramin Ganeshran, found the descendants of these Westport slaves. And there they are. And they came and gave a series of very powerful speeches. And I'm going to end with this, and I'll pop on really quickly and say hello and see if you have questions, or let's get rid of this guy. Bottom left, 1860 production of cotton. Each dot is 2,000 bales. All right, so that's the Civil War, right as it starts. All those black dots are cotton production of 2,000 bales or more. Now on the left are the areas that voted for Barack Obama, 2008, and then combined on the right. So this tells you many, many things. But one of them is, it tells you that the descendants are still there. And one of the many reasons they're still there is the endemic poverty. They couldn't leave. And so it's a one-to-one relationship to the biggest cotton growing areas to this day in America. Okay. We, of course, ran over, but hi, how are you? And I don't see any questions in the chat function, and you're probably just completely exhausted. So I will bid you a good night. And by the way, one of the things, hi Caroline, aren't you glad I went 15 minutes over?
It's amazing. No one left. Everyone's stayed. This is so fun.
I just want to leave you on this note, Caroline. Again, what happened was this pandemic, the worst in American history in 1919 to 1921, the worst race riots in American history since Reconstruction. And what they were doing was they were absorbing the most dramatic technological developments in the history of the world to that point, the automobile, the airplane, the radio. And that's exactly what we're doing right now with the son or daughter of the Industrial Revolution, the Information Revolution. It's caused a lot of dislocation. But what happened after that was the economy exploded as it is now. And I think, Caroline, we are on the verge of the roaring 2020.
Bring it on, Deej.
All right.
It's going to be great.
Hey, good
Thank
buddy.
you so much for joining us. This was amazing. We appreciate your time and your interest and your everything. It was awesome. Thank you so much.
And I can't wait to see you, Alistair, and most of your children. And you know which one I'm talking about.
We know. See
She's delightful kids. They're my favorite kids. Okay. See you soon.
We'll see you at the library soon. Thanks so much.
You bet.